Hi friends, very often we see in human physiology that the same chemical or same transmitter produces two opposite responses in two different regions of the body. For instance, adrenaline produces vasoconstriction somewhere and vasodilation elsewhere, or adenosine, another transmitter. It causes vasoconstriction somewhere, vasodilation elsewhere. Eventually, these responses, they are opposite in nature, but they are suitable, convenient for the body's physiology. But how does this happen? How is this possible? Everything boils down to the receptor and the channel associated with the receptor. So in this video, we are going to see two such channels. Both of them are potassium channels and how they behave in different conditions. Let's take the example of hypoxia. Again, hypoxia causes vasoconstriction in the pulmonary vessels, but elsewhere in the systemic circulation, elsewhere in the body, hypoxia induces vasodilation. Now it is beneficial. In both those places, the responses are benevolent or convenient for the body and its physiology. See how? Let's say a representative diagram for the lungs, and let's say in one region there is hypoxia. It's a hypoxic region. There is no ventilation taking place in this part of the lung. In that case, the blood flow to that region will be a wasteful expenditure, and therefore the blood vessels in that region, hypoxic region, they show vasoconstriction, they undergo vasoconstriction, and they divert the blood to a better ventilated alveolus so that better gas exchange can occur. So vasoconstriction produced by hypoxia in the lungs is a beneficial response in the lungs. Elsewhere in the body, hypoxia produces vasodilation. So how it is beneficial? Easy. If there is hypoxic region or some organ or tissue is hypoxic, then it will cause vasodilation in that area. Vasodilation means the blood vessel expands and there is increased blood flow to that region. Increased blood flow means more oxygen brought in and the hypoxia is corrected. So two opposite responses produced by hypoxia, and both are for the benefit of the body physiology. How was that possible? Because of the potassium channels. So there are two potassium channels which we are going to discuss in this video: O2-sensitive potassium channel and ATP-sensitive potassium channel. O2-sensitive potassium channel in the pulmonary vessels, it produces vasoconstriction, and ATP-sensitive potassium channel in the systemic vessels, it produces vasodilation there. So we will discuss these two channels in detail. How their gating behavior depends on intracellular O2 and intracellular ATP. Let's have a look at the pulmonary blood vessel. Here is a representative diagram that shows pulmonary blood vessel, and in the wall of the vessel there are these smooth muscle cells. So now when the smooth muscle contracts, the blood vessel constricts, and when the smooth muscle relaxes, the blood vessel will dilate. Simple. Let's enlarge this one particular smooth muscle cell to understand what happens in the membrane of that cell. Look, if there is hypoxia, no oxygen to open the gates of this O2-sensitive potassium channel, and therefore because of the hypoxia in this region, the O2-sensitive potassium channel's gates will remain closed. No oxygen, so it is sensed and the gates cannot open, they remain closed. Which means what? It means that the intracellular potassium in this smooth muscle cell, it could have gone out, diffused out through this channel, potassium channel. Now it cannot go out. That means the intracellular potassium simply comes and gets lined up on the inner aspect of the membrane. It had started its journey, it had started its diffusion to go out, but the channels have remained closed because of the hypoxia. So it just comes and lines up near the membrane on the inside. And positive charges lining up on the inside of the membrane means membrane depolarization. The membrane has excited, and this membrane depolarization will result in the contraction of this smooth muscle cell. Smooth muscle cell contracts means the blood vessel constricts. Hypoxia has induced vasoconstriction in the lungs, in the pulmonary vessels. Now let's have a look at systemic blood vessels, how the response is different. In the case of systemic blood vessel, again, in the wall of the blood vessel, there are these smooth muscle cells. Let's enlarge a smooth muscle cell. Now, in this case, the channel is ATP-sensitive potassium channel in the membrane of this smooth muscle cell. If there is hypoxia in the region and there is resultant hypoxia inside the cell, lack of oxygen means lack of ATP generation. So inside this cell, there would be a lack of ATP. This cell was going to sense the ATP and the gates were going to close. But that cannot happen. Lack of ATP causes ATP-sensitive potassium channel to remain open. I repeat once again. These gates, they were going to sense the intracellular ATP and they were going to close. Now, because of hypoxia, lack of oxygen, so lack of ATP generation, and therefore these gates cannot close, they remain open. What would be the result? Now it's easy to guess that the potassium channel is now remaining open. That means intracellular potassium will leak out, diffuse out. Potassium diffusing out means positive charges leaking out. Positive charges leaking out means intracellularly excess negative charges will be left behind, which means hyperpolarization of this cell. Its membrane is hyperpolarized, and hyperpolarization means inhibition. So this cell now cannot contract, it is inhibited. The smooth muscle cell will relax, and relaxation of the smooth muscle means the blood vessel will dilate. Systemic blood vessel dilates because of the hypoxia, so more blood will be brought into that region because of the dilation and more oxygen. So hypoxia is corrected. That's how these two channels behave. We can call them hypoxia sensitive potassium channel and ATP sensitive potassium channel because they require their gates to remain open by sensing the intracellular oxygen or ATP. So that was about the hypoxia producing different responses in different regions. Now we will take one more example of these channels each. Let's say O2 sensitive potassium channel. Where else do we find this channel? Well, hypoxia is a stimulus for the peripheral chemoreceptors. So in the peripheral chemoreceptors, we find these channels, O2 sensitive potassium channel. You know, the peripheral chemoreceptors are located in the carotid artery. The receptor or the receptor organ is called as carotid body, and in the arch of aorta, aortic bodies. They are going to sense hypoxia and accordingly they are going to stimulate the respiration. So here is a common carotid artery in which in the wall of this artery you see a carotid body. Inside the carotid body there is chemosensitive cell which is called as glomus cell. Glomus cell is the chemosensitive cell, and in the membrane of this glomus cell there is this O2 sensitive potassium channel. So what happens is, if there is hypoxia in the region of carotid body, the O2 sensitive potassium channel will close. So we can call it hypoxia sensitive potassium channel. It senses there is no oxygen to open the channel. There is hypoxia, so the channel remains closed. Again, what's the result? Intracellular potassium cannot leak out, so it just comes and lines up on the inner aspect of the membrane. It means this glomus cell, which is the chemosensitive cell or chemoreceptor cell, is now depolarized. It has generated a receptor potential, depolarizing potential, and that will convert into the action potentials, which will be carried by the 9th cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve. The signals will be taken to the respiratory center, and that is how the respiratory center is informed about the hypoxia. So another example of O2 sensitive potassium channel and how hypoxia is sensed by the channels and their gates, they behave accordingly. Let's take an example of ATP sensitive potassium channel, and the classic example of ATP sensitive potassium channel is pancreatic beta cell. The beta cell in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. In this cell's membrane we have ATP sensitive potassium channel, and what is its role? Its role is to secrete insulin by the beta cell in response to the plasma glucose levels, increased plasma glucose levels resulting in release of insulin. So there, this channel has an important, crucial role to play. Look, first of all, whenever we consume food, consume carbohydrates, plasma glucose levels will increase, and in response to that we need secretion of insulin. Now this insulin is stored inside the vesicle, and those vesicles will release the insulin by exocytosis, right? So whenever plasma glucose increases, we need this insulin to be secreted by exocytosis. But the point is, for exocytosis there is a need for calcium, and you know calcium cannot be kept high inside the cytosol. It's going to be damaging to the cell organelles. That means calcium has to come in from outside, and therefore for that purpose there are voltage gated calcium channels, so that whenever the insulin secretion is required by exocytosis, the ECF calcium will come in, but only when the gates open for the calcium channel. Now I said voltage gated calcium channels means what? They will sense the membrane voltage and only then they will open. Membrane depolarization is the voltage change will be sensed by them. Now the only question that remains is, how is it that the membrane is depolarized in response to the plasma glucose? That will complete the story. Plasma glucose, increased plasma glucose after the meals. This increased plasma glucose will enter the pancreatic beta cell. Once it is inside the cell, it will undergo glycolysis. This glycolysis will generate the ATPs, fast generation of the ATPs. And once ATP is generated inside the cell, it is sensed by the ATP sensitive potassium channel. So don't forget, in the membrane of the pancreatic beta cell, there is ATP sensitive potassium channel. It will sense these ATPs, increased ATP, and the channel will close. Remember, in the case of blood vessel, there was lack of ATP, and therefore the channel remained open, and therefore the potassium leaked out of the channel, leaked out of the cell. Here the ATPs are generated and they are sensed by the channel, and the channel is closed. Yes, obviously, channel gets closed. It means what? Intracellular potassium, which had started its journey to leak out of the cell, to diffuse out of the cell through these channels, now it cannot diffuse out. That means intracellular potassium just comes and starts lining up inside the membrane, inner aspect of the membrane, and that's it. positive charges lining up on the inner aspect of the membrane means membrane is depolarizing. Depolarization of the membrane is a voltage change which is sensed by the voltage gated calcium channels. Those channels will open, calcium from the ECF will enter the cell, and insulin will be secreted by exocytosis. So a very critical role played by ATP sensitive potassium channel in the release of insulin. In fact, there are drugs which are given in diabetes which are called as insulin secretagogues. That is, those drugs cause insulin secretion. How? Those drugs, for example, there is a category called as sulfonylureas. The sulfonylurea drugs, they have receptor on this ATP sensitive potassium channel. This receptor is called as SUR, sulfonylurea receptor. So when the drug is administered, the sulfonylurea, it will bind with this channel and it will produce the same response which is produced by the glucose. That is closure of the ATP sensitive potassium channel, and the subsequent events will follow. Insulin will be released. So these are some of the examples of potassium channel, O2 sensitive and ATP sensitive potassium channels. They are producing varied responses which are benevolent for the body's physiology.